Judge calls black woman a fraud, unaware she's the CIA's most elite agent. The storm rolled over Washington, D.C. like a living thing, thick clouds swallowing the early morning light, thunder shaking the glass windows of the city's most powerful buildings. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, drenching the stone steps of the federal courthouse, where dozens of reporters had gathered, gripping their microphones like weapons, hungry for the day's headline. A damp newspaper fluttered against the pavement, its bold black type barely legible beneath the water droplets. Fraud case shakes D.C. Who is Naomi Carter? A sleek, government-issued black sedan slowed to a stop at the curb. The door swung open. Dr. Naomi Carter stepped out. She was an enigma wrapped in poise, a woman who had spent decades navigating the shadows. But today, she walked straight into the light, not as a protector of the nation, but as the accused. The rain did not touch her. It slid off the sharp lines of her tailored navy blue suit, glistening against the smooth polish of her black heels. She moved with the measured grace of someone who was always in control, even as the world around her tried to rip her apart. Beside her, Rebecca Vaughn, her defense attorney, adjusted the strap of her leather case, her sharp eyes scanning the sea of reporters, looking for threats that were not physical but just as lethal. Naomi's case had already been tried in the court of public opinion, and the verdict was damning. Then came the onslaught. A wall of cameras, microphones, and shouted accusations. Dr. Carter, are you a fraud? Did you fake your academic records? If you really worked for the government, why are there no records of you? Are you even who you say you are? The words sliced through the rain, feeding the media spectacle that had turned her life into a headline. Naomi didn't flinch, didn't slow her steps. She had been interrogated in underground black sites, forced to lie her way past foreign intelligence officers who would have executed her without hesitation. This was nothing. But what lay inside that courtroom? That was a different kind of battlefield, because the real danger wasn't proving her innocence, it was keeping the truth buried. The clack of Naomi's heels echoed through the marble halls, her posture upright, her expression unreadable. On either side of her, spectators and reporters lingered, watching in silence. Some whispered under their breath, their curiosity thick with skepticism. This doesn't make sense. How does someone that successful leave no trace? They say her entire work history is fake. How do you fake a whole life? Maybe she changed her name. Maybe she's hiding something worse. If she had nothing to hide, why isn't there a single employer backing her up? The murmurs grew as she passed. The doubt, the suspicion. It was expected. It wasn't the first time Naomi Carter's credibility had been questioned. But today it wasn't whispered in secret government briefings or exchanged in backroom conversations between cautious officials. Today, it was the foundation of a criminal trial. And sitting at the front of the courtroom, presiding over it all, was Judge Richard Callaway. Judge Callaway was not a man easily impressed. Late 50s, silver-haired and hardened by 3 decades on the bench, he had built his career on cold facts, solid evidence, and absolute control. And right now, staring down at the thin case file labeled Naomi Carter, he saw none of those things. Too many missing records. Too many questions without answers. He adjusted his glasses, flipping through the pages before lifting his gaze to the defendant. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. All rise. The Honorable Judge Richard Callaway presiding. A rustle of movement swept through the courtroom as the jury, lawyers, and spectators stood. The weight of national attention settled over the room like an unbearable pressure. Judge Callaway leaned back in his chair, studying Naomi with a curious but skeptical gaze. Then his voice, calm, deliberate, carrying an undercurrent of doubt. Dr. Carter, given the sheer amount of missing records, academic, employment, federal, do you expect this court to take your word for it? The question hung in the air, sharp and damning. The gallery waited, some leaning forward in anticipation. Ethan Monroe, the lead prosecutor, hid a smirk behind his fingertips. He had been waiting for this moment. He wanted to see Naomi Carter struggle to explain herself, but Naomi did not struggle. She did not falter. She lifted her chin, her voice smooth as steel. I expect this court to consider the truth. A beat of silence. Judge Callaway exhaled slowly, placing his hands together. Ethan Monroe's smirk widened. Because right now, the only truth that mattered was the one he was about to paint. The trial had begun, and Naomi Carter was standing at the edge of a knife. The air in the courtroom had shifted. The hushed murmurs in the gallery, the eager scratching of pens against notepads, the blinking red lights of recording cameras. Everyone was waiting for blood. At the prosecution's table, Ethan Monroe straightened his tie, smoothing out the lapels of his charcoal gray suit. This was his moment. He had built his career on high-profile cases. But this was different. This was his ticket to national recognition. He stood slowly, taking his time, letting the silence stretch before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, stepping toward them with the easy confidence of a man who believed he had already won. "This isn't just a fraud case. This is a deception of national proportions." The words landed like a hammer. The jury's eyes flickered toward Naomi. A deception of national proportions. It was a powerful phrase, the kind that played well on the evening news. Ethan Monroe knew exactly what he was doing. "Dr. Naomi Carter," he continued, pacing slowly. "The woman sitting before you claims to have an extensive background in national security. She claims to have earned prestigious degrees, held government positions, and contributed to this country in ways we can't even begin to understand." He stopped, turning to face the jury directly. "And yet, there is not a single verified record of her existence before 5 years ago." A murmur rippled through the gallery. The reporters in the front row exchanged glances, their pens moving frantically across their legal pads. Monroe turned, gesturing toward Naomi with an almost theatrical level of disappointment. Her degrees fabricated, her employment history falsified, even her name. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "May not be real." The silence was deafening. At the defense table, Rebecca Vaughn's jaw tightened. She glanced at Naomi, whose expression remained unreadable, but there was tension in her shoulders, a barely perceptible shift that only someone who truly knew her could catch. Monroe folded his hands in front of him, lowering his voice slightly, as if he were confiding in the jury. "Now, I don't expect you to take my word for it. I brought receipts." He turned toward the witness stand. "The prosecution calls Dr. Patrick Silverman to the stand." A bespectacled man in his late 50s took the stand, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, his suit crisp and professional. Dr. Patrick Silverman, an academic with a long career in forensic credential verification. After the formalities, Monroe wasted no time. "Dr. Silverman, in your professional capacity, did you conduct an analysis of Dr. Carter's educational records?" "Yes, I did," Silverman replied, adjusting his glasses. "I reviewed all publicly available databases, academic transcripts, and university archives." "And what did you find?" Silverman turned slightly, facing the jury. "I found nothing." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Silverman continued. "Dr. Carter claims to have obtained a PhD from MIT in cryptography and intelligence analysis. However, there are no records of her enrollment. No transcripts, no thesis, no faculty members who can confirm she was ever there." Monroe nodded slowly, turning toward Naomi for effect. "So, in your expert opinion, is it possible that Dr. Carter could have earned this degree without leaving behind a single trace?" Silverman shook his head firmly. MIT maintains meticulous records of all graduates, especially in specialized fields like cryptography. If she had truly attended, there would be evidence. There isn't." Monroe let the words hang in the air before gesturing toward the defense table. No further questions. Rebecca Vaughn stood, smoothing her blazer. "Dr. Silverman, is it possible for records to be classified or sealed under government authority?" Silverman hesitated. "In rare cases, yes, but even then there would be restricted indicators in the system. In this case, there are none." Rebecca nodded, knowing this was an uphill battle. "And are you aware that some intelligence personnel operate under assumed identities, making their academic credentials deliberately untraceable?" Silverman pursed his lips. "I'm aware of the theory, but in all my years of work, I have never encountered a case where someone's entire academic history was erased." Rebecca glanced at Naomi. Neither had he, because Naomi Carter wasn't just any intelligence officer. The next witness was Claire Benson, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Ms. Benson," Monroe began, "you were tasked with verifying Dr. Carter's federal employment history, correct?" "Yes," she replied crisply. "I reviewed every available government personnel database looking for any record of Dr. Carter's employment in intelligence, law enforcement, or federal security." "And did you find any?" Benson shook her head. "There is no record of her employment in any federal capacity." The gallery's whispers grew louder. Monroe pressed on. "So, Ms. Benson, in your expert opinion, could Dr. Carter have served in any high-level government role, as she claims, without a single federal record?" Benson hesitated only for a moment before responding. "If she had worked for the government at the level she claims, there would be classified personnel files, restricted documents, something, but there's nothing." Monroe turned to face Naomi. "Nothing." And for the first time, Naomi's composure cracked, just slightly. Not enough for the jury to see, but Monroe saw it. He smelled blood. Monroe's last witness was Isaac Reynolds, a man in his early 50s who had once worked at the Rutherford Institute for Global Policy, the very think tank where Naomi Carter had supposedly held a high-level research position. Reynolds sat rigidly on the stand, eyes avoiding Naomi's. "Mr. Reynolds, did Dr. Carter work with you at the Rutherford Institute?" Reynolds cleared his throat. "No." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Monroe feigned concern. "Are you sure? Because Dr. Carter claims she held a senior position there." Reynolds nodded stiffly. "She never worked there. I remember when her name first came up in our database. It was flagged as unverified. HR couldn't track any paperwork, no hiring forms, no payroll records, nothing." "So what are you saying, Mr. Reynolds?" Reynolds took a breath, then delivered the final blow. "I'm saying Naomi Carter never existed in our system." Judge Calloway folded his hands together, watching Naomi closely. He had heard defendants spin stories before. He had seen desperate attempts to explain away missing evidence, gaps in documentation, inconsistencies that didn't quite add up. And Naomi Carter? She was the biggest inconsistency of them all. Rebecca stood to object. "Your Honor, there are alternative explanations for classified personnel missing from public records." Calloway cut her off. "Ms. Vaughn, this is a courtroom, not a conspiracy theory forum." A low chuckle rippled through the spectators. Monroe allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, his cold eyes locking onto Naomi. "You're going to have to do better than that, Dr. Carter." Naomi didn't move, didn't blink. But inside, she felt it. They were tearing her apart, and she had no proof to stop them. The courtroom buzzed with muted energy, but Naomi Carter remained still. At the defense table, her fingers rested lightly against the polished surface, her expression unreadable. The prosecution's case had been relentless, dismantling her credibility piece by piece. No verifiable degrees, no employment records, no witnesses to confirm her past. To the jury, to the press, to the world watching from their television screens, she was a mystery wrapped in deception, and she couldn't correct them. Because the truth was worse than the lie. If she spoke, if she explained why her records didn't exist, why no employer would vouch for her, why there were no official traces of her existence before 5 years ago, people would die. Her heartbeat was steady, her breathing controlled, but beneath the surface a storm raged. She wanted to stand up and scream the truth, that she had spent years protecting this country from threats they would never hear about, that the people sitting in judgment of her had been sleeping soundly at night because of the very work she did, that the reason her past didn't exist was because it had been erased. By design. She had operated in the dark so that others could live in the light. And now, the very system she had protected was crucifying her for it. Her eyes flicked toward Ethan Monroe, the prosecutor, who was watching her with that smug glint in his eye. He thought he had her. He thought he'd won. But Monroe had no idea who he was dealing with. Naomi wasn't Naomi Carter back then. She had been someone else. A name assigned to her. One of many she would wear like a second skin throughout her career. The first lesson had been clear. You don't exist. The voice belonged to Instructor Cole, a hardened CIA operative with decades in the field. He stood before the recruits, 15 of them hand-selected from military intelligence, law enforcement, and top-tier universities. Naomi stood at attention, eyes locked forward. "Everything you were before this moment is gone," Cole continued, his voice cold, methodical. "If you need someone to know your name, you're already dead." The words settled heavily in the damp Virginia air. Naomi had excelled in the classroom, international relations, cryptography, counterterrorism strategy. But this was different. This was where she would become a phantom. The training was relentless. Weapons training in the dead of night. Immersive language courses. Fluent Russian in 6 months, Arabic in 8. Counter-surveillance drills that pushed her to the edge of paranoia. They were taught how to disappear, how to scrub identities, forge new ones, how to infiltrate places they were never meant to be. Naomi's defining moment came in week 16, a live extraction drill. She had been dropped in an unfamiliar city with no phone, no ID, and no contacts. The assignment? Find the target, extract them without being seen, and make it back to the safe house in under 3 hours. She had done it in 2. By the time her instructor caught up with her at the rendezvous point, he had just stared at her, shaking his head. "Damn, Carter," he had muttered. "You might be the best ghost we've ever made." The alley was dark, slick with melting snow, the neon glow from a nearby cafe sign reflecting against the ice. Naomi adjusted the scarf around her neck, walking at a measured pace, her heartbeat calm despite the gunfire she had narrowly escaped 20 minutes earlier. Ahead, a nervous man in his 50s, bundled in a thick coat, scanned the street. His breath came in short, quick puffs of steam. A Russian intelligence officer turned U.S. informant. He had vital intel about an impending attack on a European embassy, but he was about to be silenced. Naomi had intercepted the kill order. She approached him, voice low. "Walk with me." He hesitated, but the fear in his eyes overpowered his doubt. He fell into step beside her. 2 minutes later, a black sedan turned onto the street behind them. They had been made. Naomi didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, yanked him into the side alley, and pressed a Glock into his hands. "You run when I say, not before." She turned, pressed her back against the cold brick, and counted. 3, 2, 1. The first gunman stepped into view. Naomi fired once, a clean shot to the kneecap. The man went down screaming. The second hesitated, a mistake. She shot him next. "Go," she barked, shoving the informant forward. They sprinted through the alleys, cutting through side streets, disappearing into the chaotic pulse of Moscow's underground train system. Within 48 hours, the informant was on U.S. soil, and the embassy attack was prevented. Naomi's name? Nowhere in the official report. She had done her job. Then, as always, she had disappeared. Naomi blinked, pushing the memory aside. The courtroom came back into focus. Then she heard it. A quiet, fragile voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "Tell me this isn't true, Naomi." The words weren't spoken by the judge, or the prosecutor, or a journalist looking for a scoop. They came from the gallery. Naomi turned her head slightly, her control slipping for just a fraction of a second. Margaret Carter, her mother. She hadn't seen her in years, not because she hadn't wanted to, but because it was safer that way. Margaret Carter was a proud, dignified woman in her late 60s, dressed in a navy blue church coat, her silver hair pulled back neatly. But her eyes were red, filled with something between sorrow and betrayal. Naomi's throat tightened. Margaret took a small step forward, clasping her hands together. Her voice broke. "Please, just tell me the truth." Naomi felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. The jury watched. The judge waited. Ethan Monroe folded his arms, amused by the sudden emotional spectacle. Rebecca Vaughn placed a gentle hand on Naomi's arm, a silent reminder. Stay in control. Naomi inhaled slowly, locking her emotions away. She couldn't tell her mother the truth. Not here, not now. So instead, she said nothing. The silence cut deeper than words ever could. Margaret Carter's lip trembled, her heart breaking in real time. She shook her head once, as if trying to convince herself this wasn't happening. Then, with slow, heavy steps, she turned and walked out of the courtroom. The doors slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed, and Naomi Carter sat there in the trial of her life as the one person she had fought hardest to protect walked away. The weight of the courtroom settled over Naomi Carter like a slow-moving vice. The evidence against her was mounting, her defense was faltering, and the judge's patience was wearing thin. At the defense table, Rebecca Vaughn's fingers tapped anxiously against her legal pad. There wasn't much left to argue. Not when every record of Naomi's past had seemingly vanished into thin air. No transcripts, no employment history, no proof of who she really was. Rebecca had handled tough cases before, but this was different. Normally, if a client was innocent, there was something, a witness, a document, a shred of verifiable truth. But with Naomi, there was nothing. And the jury was starting to believe that meant one thing: she was lying. Judge Richard Calloway rubbed his temples, his patience thinning. "Ms. Vaughn," he said, leveling a hard stare at the defense attorney, "thus far the prosecution has presented multiple witnesses and verified documentation to support their case. Your rebuttal has consisted of vague theories and speculation." Rebecca clenched her jaw. "Your Honor, there is more to this than—" "I don't deal in speculation," Calloway cut her off, his voice sharp. "I deal in facts, and right now the facts are stacked against your client." Naomi remained still. She had endured worse interrogations than this, but she could see it in Rebecca's face. They were losing. The prosecution had built a case that she didn't exist. And without intervention, without some kind of lifeline, Naomi Carter, or at least the version of her that the public knew, was about to be erased. Across the room, Ethan Monroe watched with the satisfaction of a man who knew he was winning. He stood, adjusting the cuff of his suit as he approached the defense table. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only Naomi and Rebecca could hear. "Let's be honest," Monroe said smoothly. "This isn't looking good for you." Rebecca glared at him. "Unless you have an actual legal motion to file, Mr. Monroe, back off." Monroe ignored her. His eyes locked on Naomi. "Plead guilty to perjury," he said, his voice calm but full of intent. "And we'll drop the fraud charges. No prison time. You walk out of here today." Rebecca scoffed. "You want her to admit to lying just so you can close the case?" Monroe smirked. "She won't win this trial. We both know that. But if she pleads now, we can control the damage." Naomi finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "If I plead guilty, what happens next?" Monroe leaned closer, lowering his voice even more. "The press moves on. Your name disappears from the headlines in a month. You get a slap on the wrist, probation, maybe community service, and you go back to whatever life you were leading before you made this mess." Naomi studied him. Monroe thought he was giving her an escape, but he didn't understand. If she took the deal, she'd be admitting to something that wasn't true. If she took the deal, she'd be branding herself a fraud forever. Her life's work, the missions, the sacrifices, the lives she had saved, would be erased, buried beneath a guilty plea that would become her legacy. And that was worse than prison. Naomi leaned in, her expression calm, her voice lethal. "No deal." Monroe's jaw clenched. "You sure about that?" She didn't blink. "Absolutely." Monroe let out a slow exhale, shaking his head. "Your funeral." He turned sharply and strode back to his table. Rebecca sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I really hope you know what you're doing." Naomi didn't answer, because right now she wasn't sure if she did. The courthouse cafeteria was empty, save for a few court clerks nursing stale coffee. Naomi sat at a table near the farthest corner, staring at the black screen of her phone, waiting for a call that might never come. Her lifeline. Then it rang. She answered immediately, pressing the phone to her ear. "Carter," a deep voice said on the other end. "It's Michael Stanton." Hi. Naomi's grip tightened on the phone. Stanton wasn't just a CIA official. He was the official, the director of intelligence security, the man responsible for cleaning up operational disasters before they reached the public eye. If he was calling her now, that meant one of two things. Either they were about to help her or they were about to abandon her. "Tell me you have something," Naomi said, her voice low. A brief silence. Then, "We're working on it," Stanton said. "But we can't declassify anything fast enough." Naomi closed her eyes, inhaling slowly. "That's not good enough." "You knew the rules, Carter." Stanton's voice was controlled, steady. "If you get caught, you're on your own." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "That's what I get for 20 years of service?" Stanton didn't answer right away. Then finally, "It's not about you." Of course it wasn't. It was about the agency, the missions, the assets still in the field, the secrets that couldn't be exposed, not even to save one of their own. Stanton exhaled. "Listen, we're trying to run interference. There are discussions happening at the highest levels, but Carter—" He paused. Naomi's jaw tightened. She already knew what he was about to say. "There's a chance no one is coming for you." Silence stretched between them. Then Stanton sighed. "But if things go south, and we have no other choice, you'll know." He hung up. Naomi stared at the phone in her hand, her heartbeat steady. They weren't coming. The CIA wouldn't risk burning an entire classified network just to save her. And that meant Naomi Carter was truly alone. The air in the courtroom was suffocating. Everywhere Naomi looked, skeptical jurors, murmuring reporters, the prosecutor's smug expression, she saw the walls closing in. For the past week, Ethan Monroe had stripped her identity to the bone, painting her as a fraud, a liar, a woman who had fabricated an entire existence. And the worst part, he was winning. Rebecca Vaughn sat stiffly beside her, scanning her notes as if a miracle would appear between the pages. But there were no miracles left. No secret witnesses, no surprise evidence. The CIA had made itself clear. She was on her own. Naomi clenched her hands together beneath the table, her pulse steady despite the noose tightening around her. Then, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open, and everything changed. A man in a black suit strode down the aisle, his face unreadable, his posture rigid. He didn't acknowledge Naomi, didn't glance at the jury. He walked straight to the bench where he handed Judge Richard Calloway an envelope. A thick, unmarked folder, sealed, stamped TOPSECRET. The tension in the room spiked like an electric current. Rebecca sat up straighter. Monroe's smirk faltered. The jury leaned forward. Judge Calloway took the folder, his brow furrowing. He turned it over in his hands, glancing at the man who had delivered it. "And who exactly sent this?" Calloway asked. The man didn't blink. "Classified origins, Your Honor. Directly from Langley." A ripple of gasps rolled through the courtroom. Langley, as in CIA headquarters. Monroe stood abruptly, the first trace of uncertainty flashing across his face. "Your Honor, I object to this sudden—" Calloway held up a hand, silencing him. Then, without another word, he broke the seal. Naomi watched his face carefully as he flipped open the file. For the first time since the trial began, the judge looked shaken. His eyes skimmed the contents, his lips pressing into a thin line. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He swallowed. Then he turned the page. Another pause. His fingers tightened around the folder. Whatever was in that file, it was big. Rebecca leaned in, whispering, "What the hell did they just give him?" Naomi didn't answer. She already knew. And judging by the judge's pale face, so did he. Calloway snapped the folder shut. The courtroom erupted. Monroe slammed his hand on the prosecution's table. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense does not have the right to introduce last-minute evidence without disclosure." Calloway slowly lifted his gaze. His face was unreadable, but something had shifted in his demeanor. The judge, who had spent this entire trial doubting Naomi's credibility, questioning her existence, glaring at her as if she were a criminal. Now, he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Monroe took a breath, trying to recover. "Your Honor, I demand to see those documents." Calloway didn't blink. His grip on the file was tight, like it held something he wished he could unsee. "Not if it involves national security," he said finally. The room went completely silent. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Wait, was she really CIA?" Another voice, "That's impossible, isn't it?" Monroe bristled. "Your Honor, the prosecution has the right to review—" "No, you don't," Calloway said, sharper this time. He set the file down, exhaling through his nose. "Not if what's in here is classified beyond your clearance level, Mr. Monroe." Monroe's face darkened. "You can't be serious." Calloway leaned forward, folding his hands. "I have never been more serious in my life." A murmur of unease spread through the jury. They weren't sure what was happening, but they knew it was something huge. Monroe tried again, his voice lower, tighter. "If Dr. Carter is who she claims to be, then the public deserves to know." Calloway's gaze hardened. "Or maybe, Mr. Monroe, the public was never supposed to know." Another ripple of gasps. Naomi sat still, her expression blank. But inside, her mind was racing. The CIA had intervened, but why now? Had the agency finally decided to protect her? Or had they just decided to protect themselves? Whatever the reason, it didn't matter. Because in the span of 5 minutes, the entire trajectory of this case had changed, and Naomi Carter was no longer on trial. The weight of the sealed CIA dossier still sat on Judge Calloway's desk, its presence like a loaded gun in the center of the courtroom. Everyone was waiting, the jury, the press, the restless spectators shifting in their seats. And at the heart of it all, Naomi Carter sat unmoving, hands folded neatly in her lap, calm, unshaken, silent. But she knew the storm that was about to break. Judge Calloway exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing into the pages of the classified report one last time before he looked up. His expression was tight, reluctant, yet resigned. The courtroom held its breath. Then finally he spoke. "Dr. Carter," Calloway began, his voice measured but laced with something unfamiliar. "Was it respect? I have spent the last several days listening to testimony, reviewing evidence, and demanding answers to very serious questions about your past." He glanced at the CIA file again, almost like he wished he hadn't read what was inside. His gaze flickered toward Ethan Monroe, who was perched at the prosecution's table, barely concealing his impatience. Calloway inhaled deeply before continuing. "Based on the newly provided intelligence records, it is now evident that the defendant's identity and background have been verified at the highest levels of national intelligence." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, shouts, the frantic click of cameras. Monroe shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd." Calloway's gavel slammed down. "Sit down, Mr. Monroe." Monroe hesitated, his jaw clenched, but obeyed. Calloway turned back to Naomi, his expression unreadable. "As such," he continued, his voice firm, "this court finds that there is no credible basis to move forward with charges of fraud." He straightened in his seat, his next words clear and final. "All charges against Dr. Naomi Carter are hereby dismissed." A beat of stunned silence. Then, chaos. Monroe stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. This was supposed to be his defining case. A national scandal, a fraudster exposed, a victory that would have catapulted him into the political spotlight. Instead, he had been played by a woman who had sat there silently while he tore her apart piece by piece, never once hinting at the power she held. Now, his career was in jeopardy. His own credibility was on trial, and worst of all, he still didn't know what was in that damn file. He turned to Naomi, expecting to see triumph in her expression. But she wasn't even looking at him. She was already standing, already walking away, like he didn't matter, like he had never mattered. The second Naomi stepped outside the courthouse, the press surged forward like a tidal wave. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended, voices overlapping in a frantic blur of questions. "Dr. Carter, how do you respond to the fraud allegations being dropped? Were you ever actually a professor at MIT? Did you deliberately erase your past? Will you sue the U.S. government for wrongful prosecution?" Naomi didn't answer. She just kept walking. Then, one voice cut through the noise. A young reporter, her voice sharp and clear. Dr. Carter, if you're really CIA, why didn't they save you? Naomi stopped, just for a fraction of a second. Then, without a word, she turned away and disappeared into the waiting black sedan. She didn't need saving. She never had. Part 7. Epilogue. A new mission. The walls of Langley headquarters were cold, impersonal, just like she remembered. The corridors were silent except for the occasional shuffle of footsteps, the low hum of classified conversations passing between operatives who barely acknowledged one another. Naomi Carter had walked these halls before, but today she wasn't sure if she still belonged here. She sat in a stark, windowless briefing room, her posture relaxed but her mind sharp. Michael Stanton stood across from her, arms folded, studying her with the unreadable gaze of a man who had sent too many people into the field and seen too few return. After a long moment, he exhaled and said, "They want you back." No preamble, no small talk, straight to the point. Naomi gave him a dry, knowing look. "I figured." Stanton slid a thin black folder across the table. No names, no official markings, just a number and a single classified directive. A mission. "High-priority intel leak," Stanton said. "It's international. We need someone who knows how to disappear." He waited. She didn't reach for the folder. Instead, her gaze flickered to the small framed photo on the desk. Her mother. Margaret Carter had sat through Naomi's trial with hope in her eyes, and she had left heartbroken. Naomi hadn't spoken to her since. She could pick up the phone. She could walk away from all of this. She could rebuild her life into something more than just a series of erased identities and forgotten missions. Or she could do what she had always done. Be a ghost. She tapped the folder once, lightly, but didn't open it. "What happens if I say no?" Stanton didn't blink. "You won't." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Naomi stood, rolling her shoulders like a fighter stepping back into the ring. She picked up the folder, just for a moment. Then, she turned toward the window, looking out over the city she had protected from the shadows for years. Washington, D.C. glowed beneath her, a city full of secrets. Her decision hung in the air. Then, did this story keep you on the edge of your seat? For more high-stakes thrillers, courtroom dramas, and intelligence conspiracies, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Don't miss our next gripping story, because in a world of secrets, the truth is never what it seems. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know. Would you trust Naomi Carter? Subscribe and stay tuned for more.